We continue our study this evening in the book of Habakkuk. Please turn, if you would, to Habakkuk chapter 3. We finished through verse 7 last time. We take up at verse 8 this evening. As we've been studying the book of Habakkuk, we've emphasized the fact that this is the period of Judah alone. The northern nation has been taken captive by Assyria, and much of the prophecy of Habakkuk concerns the fact that God has said that the southern nation of Judah, and the city of Jerusalem in particular, will be taken captive by the Chaldeans, the Babylonians. So the book begins with a question that Habakkuk has about God's intention. And what's his first question? As you recall, at the beginning of chapter 1 was the first question that he had. Susie?
Why God didn't appear to be punishing Judah for their wickedness.
Okay, so first of all, he was concerned why the evil that he observed around him in Judah, why was not being punished. So what was God's answer to that question? How did God answer the question of why the evil was not being punished? What was the answer? Fred?
His answer was to just wait. I see what's going on, and I will be punishing that.
Okay, and how is he going to punish it?
Pardon me?
How?
Oh, well, he will be bringing the Chaldeans in to punish the people for their wrongdoing.
Okay, so the answer to the first question was he'd sent the Chaldeans to punish the people of Judah, but that led then to another question, Habakkuk's second question, and what was that?
Next question. How can you use a worse people than us to punish us?
Okay, so why should you use the Chaldeans to punish the people of Judah when the Chaldeans were, if anything, worse? And God recognizes the evil, describes at great length the evil. So then in the last part of chapter 2, God answers that question. And what was his answer to that question? Really, too much of chapter 2. What was his answer to that question? So he's going to use the Chaldeans to punish the people of Judah. The Chaldeans were evil, so what's he going to do then? Susie?
He'll destroy the Chaldeans.
Well, he's going to punish the people of the Chaldeans. And so the last part of chapter 2 describes the various woes that he has pronounced upon the Chaldeans, that they're going to be punished as well. Which brought us into chapter 3, in which Habakkuk basically praises God for his justice and for his plan for the universe, and specifically his plan regarding Judah. Now, much of what we've read and will be reading is symbolic, like many songs and especially many prophecies are very symbolic. Much of this is symbolic, but I think we'll be able to get the main point, which is the lessons we need to learn from the book of Habakkuk. That brings us really through verse 7 as he begins his prayer, our song of praise to God, that he now understands what God is intending to do. Questions or comments through verse 7, anybody? Okay, so first of all, he's talking about how that God's power and his judgments deserve people's praise. So let's go ahead and read, beginning in verse 8. Let's read 8 through 13. We'd like to read chapter 3, verse 8 through 13, please. Chapter 3, verse 8 through 13. Bill, please.
O Lord, were you displeased with the rivers? Was your anger against the rivers? Was your wrath against the sea? That you rode on your horses, your chariots of salvation. Your bow was made quite ready. Oaths were sworn over your arrows, Selah. You divided the earth with rivers. The mountains saw you and trembled, and overflowing of the water passed by. The deep uttered its voice and lifted its hands on high. The sun and moon stood still in their habitation. At the light of your arrows they went. At the shining of your glittering spear, you marched through the land of indignation. You trampled the nations of anger. In anger, you went forth for the salvation of your people, for salvation with your anointed. You struck the head from the house of the wicked by laying bare from the foundation to neck.
Okay. So he's continuing his description poetically of the fact that God is going to bring justice, as he has said, first to Judah and then to the Chaldeans. So what question does he ask in verse number 8? And this is question, and the questions is question number 9 in the questions. What question does he ask in verse 8? Frank.
He asked God if he's displeased with the rivers and the sea.
Okay. Is that, in the essence of it is, was he acting the way he is because he's angry with the earth, with the things on the earth, the seas and so on? The punishments that he's going to bring is going to bring suffering, you might say, on the land, not just the people, but the land, the people is going to suffer. It was God's promised land. And so that seems to me what he's saying. Are you upset with the seas and the rivers and so on, that you bring your horses and chariots and so on? Other comments on verse 8? Now we get to verse 9, which is, for me, especially difficult. Your bow is made quite ready. Oaths were sworn over your arrows. You divided the earth with rivers. Here's the waters again, you see. And again, verse 10, the overflowing of the water passed by, which I think is why he asked the question about, is he angry with the waters? But what about the bow in verse 9? What is your significance of the fact that oaths were sworn over the arrows? Comments on that? Anybody have an explanation for that? Jason.
Seems to me like he's saying that he was ready to strike, make his judgment.
Okay.
And yet oaths were made over the force that they wouldn't be completely wiped out. There would be a punishment that was coming.
Okay. All right. He has a plan for the arrows, obviously, and the bow are symbolic of his power of punishment on the people. So the oaths being sworn over them would indicate that he had a purpose for them. It was his plan. Susie?
I looked at it from the other side, that he had made an oath or a promise to protect Israel. And so his arrows were going against the Chaldeans in promise of protecting Israel.
Okay. And he proceeds then to describe the effect on the earth and the mountains, as we mentioned earlier. Other comments on verse 9? Daryl.
I don't know if this is right or not, but yeah, you got the bow and the rods in verse 9. Maybe you had arrows instead of rods. Did your translation have arrows instead of rods?
Yes.
Okay. So the bow and the arrows, and then you've got the arrows again in verse, where was it?
11.
11.
Yeah, there it is. I don't know if I couldn't see it. They went away at the light of your arrows, at the radiance of your gleaming spear. I was wondering if these arrows, the spear, it says the gleaming spear, the light of your arrows is representative of lightning. The passage is using water and mountains and all of that, and maybe it's an expression of God's judgment.
Okay. Yeah, again, it's symbolic. So, it's definitely, I think, symbolic of his judgment, his punishment. Okay. Other comments on 9? And so, Frank.
In the English Standard Version, it said, you have stripped the sheath from your bow. In other words, made ready for this punishment. And I'm wondering, sometimes the rivers and mountain ranges were border lines between nations, and when the Chaldeans came in, or when the punishment came, the rivers and the mountains wouldn't make any difference. That punishment was going to be carried out.
Okay,
That's has anything to do with it or not.
okay, but it goes on and shows in verse 10 even that the mountains trembled, the overflowing water passed by, the deep uttered its voice, and lifted its hands on high. The sun and moon stood still in their habitation. The light of your arrows, they went at the shining of your glittering spear. All this is highly symbolic. And we've seen these kind of symbolisms in other places of God's power. Matthew 24, we talk about it sometimes in other places, the sun and the moon and the things that happen to them. But it's not literal, obviously. But it's descriptive of the fact that God is working. He's bringing his punishment on the nation for their sins. But it's highly symbolic. Other comments on either 10 and 11? Anybody else on those verses? Okay. So verse 12. What does it describe him doing in verse 12? And we're at question number 13 now. What did he do according to verse 12? Bill.
He marched through the land of indignation and trampled the nations in anger.
All right, so who else is being affected in this now in verse 12? Not just Judah, but who else? Rick?
It would have been anybody in his way, the Chaldeans or any of them.
Okay. And the nations, you remember, refer to the Gentiles. So it isn't just Judah that's going to suffer in this. It's Gentiles as well, other nations around Judah. As God is, again, pictures as marching through the land in indignation and bringing his punishment upon the people, trampling on the nations in anger. Okay, other comments on 12? All right, now 13, though, describes another aspect of it. Okay, so some people were suffering through verse 12, being punished, but what does verse 13 say? Who benefited from what was happening? Terry.
It was his salvation to his people.
All right. And so we've made that point many times, haven't we, that God doesn't just punish the wicked, he also rewards the righteous. So the punishment that he brings is, yes, the wicked are going to be punished, but the righteous people benefit from that. When evil is punished and evil removed, as a result, good people are the ones who are benefited by it, and God cares for them. He protects them, not that they're not going to suffer at all, but that ultimately, in the end, they're the ones who are going to be blessed. So the evil are punished and the righteous are blessed, and that's critical, I think, for us to always understand that. And any time that God brings punishment, he's also going to take care of his people to bless them. Other comments on the first part of verse 13? Frank.
He will bless his people, but it's when there's war and destruction, the people will suffer some anyway.
Absolutely.
And we need to pray for courage and strength in times of trials like that. I think that Daryl's report about Ukraine and Moldova, that they need strength and encouragement in this time of trial.
In this life, good people often suffer, don't they? In this life, when there are problems in life, and sometimes even more than the evil people. But we have to remember that God has the long view, the big picture in mind, in the long view, in the end, ultimately, the good people will be punished, or will be rewarded, and the wicked will be punished. And that's God's plan. And that's really what a big part of the book is about. We've got to remember that and emphasize that in our study, that God has a plan here. This isn't just happening accidentally. It's not just off the cuff, spur of the moment, where he decides, okay, I think I'll do this. He's got a plan. A plan regarding Judah, a plan regarding the Chaldeans, a plan regarding the nations around Judah. God has a plan. And ultimately, he's going to bless his people as well as punish the wicked. Okay? Other comments on the first part of verse 13, Terry?
The idea that God is correcting Judah is a part of this too, because he's still bringing his son into the world through that group of people, and he has to have the righteous remnant.
Okay, so we need to talk about the salvation. He says, with your anointed. What is the basic concept of the word of anointed? Or what is the main, one of the ways that anointing is used in the Old Testament? Debbie?
To signify who the king will be in prophets.
Okay, so it was an appointment to a position. Sometimes the priests were anointed, sometimes prophets even were anointed, the kings were anointed. So, in particular, not just the people, but the king would benefit. But who would the kings be in Judah? What do we know about who they would be? They were all descendants of David. Okay? Because of God's promise to David. So it goes back to some extent to Terry's point that God has a promise he's fulfilling, but the ultimate anointed one is the Christ, the Messiah. The word Christ means anointed. Messiah means anointed. So ultimately it's God's plan to bring the Messiah into the world according for the salvation of those who would serve him faithfully. So all of this is part of God's overall plan regarding the salvation of his people, not just punishment of the wicked. Other comments on the first part of 13? I know the last part of 13, though, he goes back to the punishment part. So the first part, you've got the salvation of the wicked and salvation with your anointed. But who is punished in the last part of 13? Who does he bring punishment on there? Still a question, number 14. Rick?
The head over the house of the wicked.
All right, the head over the house of the wicked. What happens to the head over the house of the wicked?
He's struck down and laid bare from his foundation to his neck.
Okay, in other translations, I think say from the thigh to the neck. Again, symbolism. So, what is the significance of the symbolism? The head of the house of the wicked is being laid bare. Comments? Jason?
Well, the head of the household would have been the leaders or the family heads. And so if they're scattered abroad, it would be a chance to bring in new teachings, new leadership.
Okay, and emphasize then the punishment of those who were leading sin, those who were responsible for leading the people into error. And that would, it doesn't name them or identify them specifically, but it would include people like the prophets and the false prophets and the priests and even civil rulers, kings and so on, who were leading people into error. They would be punished because they were leading, but the righteous would be saved and the heads of the wicked would be punished. Okay, other comments through 13? Anybody? Again, highly symbolic, but again, I think the overall point is clear. All right, read some more then. Let's read 14. Well, let's go ahead and read the rest of it. We'd like to read verse 14 through the end of the chapter for us, please. Chapter 3, verse 14 through 19. We'd like to read that for us, please. Neil, please.
You cursed with his own spears the head of his thrones. They stormed in to scatter us. Their exultation was like those who devour the oppressed in secret. You trampled on the sea with your horses, on the surge of many waters. I heard, and my inward parts trembled. At the sound of my lips quivered. Decay enters my bones, and in my place I tremble, because I must wait quietly for the day of distress, for the people to arise who will invade us. Though the fig tree should not blossom, and there be no fruit on the vines, though the yield of the olive should fail, and the fields produce no food, though the flock should be cut off from the fold, and there be no cattle in the stalls, yet I will exalt the Lord. I will rejoice in God of my salvation, in the God of my salvation. The Lord God is my strength, and He has made my feet like hinds' feet, and makes me walk on the high places, for the choir director on my stringed instruments.
Okay, so last part of verse 13, talk about striking the head of the house of the wicked, but verse 14 continues to talk about the head of the villages. What does he say would happen to them in verse 14? And I want to question number 15. What's going to happen to them according to verse 14? As you say, he's going to do that to the head of the villages. Frank.
They'd be thrust through with their own arrows of wickedness and destroyed. Instead of feasting on the defenseless, they would be destroyed.
Okay, so that seems to me to be the idea too, so that the things that they were using to harm other people would actually, might we say, backfire, ends up boomeranging and harming them. They're the ones who are going to suffer. They're using arrows, as again, symbolically, of things to mistreat other people. The head of the villages are mistreating others, but they're the ones who are going to be thrust through with those arrows. Okay? Other comments on the first part of 14? Susie?
I have a question. How do we determine when we transition from God dealing with the wicked of the Chaldeans to the wickedness of Israel?
Okay, I'm not sure we did transition. As far as I know, it's just talking about the punishment of the wicked in general. In fact, even he said back in verse that would include the nations, verse 12.
Okay, so maybe I misunderstood then. In verse 13, I thought I understood that you were talking about striking the house of the leaders of the wicked being Judah, but that's not what you were saying.
I don't know, he doesn't specify what wicked people he's talking about. The first part of the verse talked about the righteous, the salvation of his people and the anointed. The last part just talks about the house of the wicked. I don't know. I wasn't intending to say that I thought I knew who the wicked were.
Okay.
But we've already seen, like I said, it includes the nations in verse 12. So, other comments? Okay. So verse 14, it continues, and the arrows of the wicked are used against the head of the villages. But now the last part of verse 14, it seems to me to be a change, because he starts talking about me, Habakkuk himself, and perhaps people like him. What was being done to him, according to the last part of verse 14? What was done to him, according to the last part of verse 14? Terry.
Well, that it was like a whirlwind coming upon him to destroy or scatter him, and then they intended to rejoice about devouring the poor in secret, to do it secretly.
Okay, so this I think seems to describe more about the wicked people he's talking about, the heads of the villages and so on, what they were doing. They were mistreating good people, including Habakkuk, maybe especially Habakkuk, those who would teach the truth. The evil people, led by their leaders, would come like a whirlwind to scatter them, feasting on the poor, mistreating those who are poor, which we've talked about many times before. And so God is describing, this is some of the things that they were doing for which they were going to be punished. Okay, other comments on 14? Anybody? Okay. All right, so what's God going to do about it? Now, verse 15, back to God's action. Here's the wicked people and their leaders are mistreating the good people, the ones he's wanting to ultimately to save. What's God going to do about it? Verse 15, question 16. What you say he's going to do? Or what? Yeah. Frank.
Well, the way I visualized it is that the wicked are as widespread as the sea.
Okay.
And in God's punishment, he'll be coming across them with his army in his destruction and punishment to trample over this sea of wickedness.
Okay. Again, highly symbolic, but like a powerful military leader riding his horses and riding through the sea to accomplish his purpose, and that's a symbolism of God trampling on those who are not right, those who are wicked. Again, just in more symbolism to describe his punishment of those who are evil. Other thoughts on 15? Anybody? All right, we come then to 16, and he begins to describe how all of this affects Habakkuk. And we're getting now to the last part of this chapter. And in many ways, it's a critical part of the book and our understanding of the lessons we're supposed to get. Here Habakkuk has described the punishment of the wicked. He's going to take care of the good people in the end. There's going to be the wicked people punished. How does all this affect Habakkuk in verse 16? What is his reaction to all this? Verse 16, that's question number 17.
He was afraid.
All right, he's afraid. How does he describe his fear?
He trembled, his voice quivered.
Okay. Trembled, his lips quivered, his voice. What else? Frank.
He describes it as rottenness or decay enters his bones, and his legs tremble beneath him. Just the anguish of seeing all this happen.
Okay. So, all this description clearly showing God's punishment of the wicked is a frightening thing. Frightening thing to think of God, and specifically, why would it frighten Habakkuk for God to do these things? Why would this especially trouble him? God's not upset with him, Debbie.
Because he lives there. And he wouldn't give them up.
Okay, and it's the people around him, his loved people, his family, his nation, his loved ones. They're the ones that are going to be included in the suffering. Okay, Susie, did you have a comment? Okay, so we have his knowledge that God is going to punish his nation, his people, not just the other nations, but his. And so this is frightening to him. He's trembling. However, the last part of the verse seems to me to be, he says he's going to rest in the day of trouble. So even all this is frightening and makes him tremble, and he says he might rest in the day of trouble. So what thoughts did you have on the idea that despite all this fear, he could rest in the day of trouble? when he comes to the people and invades them with his troops. How would that give him rest, Terry?
It seems to be, depending on the translation, you're reading a couple of different thoughts. English Standard leaves you with the idea he knows this is going to happen now because he had questioned God from the very beginning. What are you going to do about this? I don't understand what you're doing. But at this point, he says, yet I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon people who invade us. As if, okay, you've explained this all to me now. I see what you're doing, and I know just to wait on you.
Okay. Other comments? Okay. It seems to me now that Habakkuk's reached the point of acceptance. He's saying, okay, I understand what you've said. At first he had a lot of questions, and no doubt still has questions, fear and trembling, but he sees that this is what God's going to do, and he's willing to accept rest, it says, in the day of trouble. He's willing to calm himself down and be willing to recognize that what God is doing is what needs to be done because it's what God has chosen to do. Okay? Other comments through the last part of 16? Rick?
I didn't quite understand what it says, he will invade them with his troops.
Okay, comments on he will invade them with his troops. Comments on that. Who would that be? Who's going to invade whom with troops? Chaldeans. As far as I know, that's what he's talking about. He's coming to invade the people with the Chaldeans, and obviously we have a lot of symbolic language, but in this case it's pretty much literal. The Chaldeans are going to invade, and eventually then the Chaldeans themselves are going to be destroyed by other nations. And it seems to me that what he's saying is he understands this now, and he's willing to accept that this is God's plan, that that's what God's going to do. Other comments, or does that make sense? All right. Now, the last three verses, to me, are almost keys to the book. This is the conclusion, and this is the lesson of the book. Verse 17. What problems does he describe might happen in verse 17? What? Darryl?
No harvest.
No harvest? Specifically, the fig tree won't blossom. No fruit on the vines, that's the grapes. The labor of the olive trees, they fail. The fields yield no food. Flocks may be cut off from the fold. No herd in the stalls. What are all those? Darryl calls them the harvest, but specifically, what are all those to the people of Judah? Their food.
Shows the barrenness that's going to be in the land.
Okay. So this is their food, and it's also their wealth. This is, for these people, these things that are described are the source of their wealth. Their flocks and herds and so on, it wasn't just food, it was their possessions for most of them, many of them, and then their crops and so on. And so if all of this fails, none of this comes like the people would hope it would, and like Habakkuk would want it to. Nevertheless, verse 18, what's he going to do? Susie.
He rejoices in the God of his salvation.
Okay. All these bad things can happen. All this suffering and hardship. He's still going to have joy in God. Why? How? Say again?
Through faith.
Faith. Back to chapter 2, verse 4. The just shall live by faith. That's, Habakkuk has now come full circle, you might say, back to the point that was made at the beginning when he was asking his questions. And the lesson, God's lesson was that the just will live by their faith. Now Habakkuk has learned the lesson. He will trust God no matter how much problems there are and what hardship there is. He's going to put his faith in God because he knows God's in charge. It's God's plan. God knows what he's doing, even when we don't know. Habakkuk has learned to accept that. Okay, other comments through verse 18 then, as he reaches that conclusion. Okay, and we've talked before of others who had to learn that same lesson. Who else can we think of that who had to learn that same lesson? No matter how much suffering there was, that God's in charge, we should accept his plan as being right and best. Job. That's the lesson. See? Very, very similar. Completely different books and completely different approach, but the same lesson. Same lesson. Even when we suffer and we don't know why, when there are problems and we don't understand, ultimately the lesson is put your faith in God. In the end, he'll take care of you. Even if it's not in this life, after this life. But you got to put your faith in him. You got to trust him to do what's good. Other comments? Frank?
Just noticing in Philippians chapter 4, verses 4 through 7, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice. Let your reasonableness be known to everyone. The Lord is at hand. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus.
And many other scriptures that teach the same lesson in different ways. How does this differ from the way many people react? How do many people react when things don't go the way they think they should? Debbie?
They try to rely on themselves to make it work better.
Okay, one thing is...
I'll get this.
Yeah, they try to take care of themselves. Okay, God's not doing what I think he should. I'll do it my way. Okay? What else do sometimes people do, Susie?
Blame them.
Okay, blame him. This isn't right. You're not a loving God. You wouldn't allow this to happen if you were a loving God. Okay? Even deny the existence of God. Okay? Rebellion, in other words. Doesn't go the way I want. What that comes down to is I'm smarter than God. That's what that is. I know better than God. It ought to go this way. He's letting it go that way. Therefore, he's wrong and I'm right. That's what that comes down to. So the last part of the chapter then, verse 19. What illustration does he use to illustrate his trust in the strength of God? How does he illustrate it in verse 19? Bill.
You'll make him walk on the high hills.
Walking on the high hills like deer's feet or hind's feet, depending on your translation. What's the significance of that? Rick.
He said the Lord God is his strength, and he's made him like deer's feet to walk on. You've seen in that nature how ram, sheep, and deer can walk in places that a human can't walk.
Okay.
And God gives him that way.
Okay. So through the strength the Lord provides, then he's able to walk where otherwise he wouldn't be able to walk. He's able to deal with the problems of life and maybe not only walk where he otherwise wouldn't, but where other people can't walk. And yet, because he trusts in God, he's able to go to the places and do the things that he needs to do to serve God. All right, need to wrap it up as we finish the book of Habakkuk. Questions or comments before we make some closing summaries here? Anybody? Let me summarize. I asked you what lessons did we learn? Here's my summary of the lessons from the book. First of all, in this life, good people do suffer. And even evil people often prosper. Nevertheless, God is just. That doesn't prove God's not just. We can trust him. He's going to, in the end, he's going to reward the righteous and he's going to punish the wicked. Trust him. He'll do what's right. He has a plan, which we oftentimes simply don't understand. It may appear he's not doing anything, he's not active, he's not involved. Trust him. In his own way, in his own time, he'll do what's right. Often he uses wicked people to accomplish his purposes, including using wicked people to punish other wicked people. But in the end, again, the righteous will be rewarded, the wicked punished. So don't complain, don't criticize God, don't try to think you've got a better way of doing it. Trust him to do right, even when we don't understand. Okay? Those are my conclusions. Any other comments or your conclusions on the book before we close? Okay? All right. Lord willing, Zephaniah then next time.